is a love story. It's a modern day love story. It follows the parallel journeys of two lovers after they decide to end their 4-year relationship. In order to reclaim that love that they have lost, what they need to do is discover things about themselves and discover what is truly important in life. And that's what I've done, and that's the message that I wanted to apply to the creation of the House of Roses. I realized what was important, and it's tender moments with friends and family, and it's not the amount of hours that we have, but it's that 1 second when you reach for someone's hand because they're afraid. And I wanted to embrace the strength of family, the incredible power of true love. And these two folks in this book, Caitlin Goodrich and Dr. Colin Thomas, who is a pediatrician, they have to go through some things before they have the ability to reconnect with one another. Caitlin has to discover things about her life, a long-buried secret, the kind of thing that changes the entire shape of a lifetime. And Dr. Colin Thomas has to revisit a painful part of his own past, and he has to make peace with the death of someone he loved and return to a place that frightens him, to his hometown of Spokane, Washington. So if at any point you can't hear me because I have severe allergies, so if you can't hear me and you actually want to, just let me know. So I hope you enjoy this. Dr. Colin Thomas needed a dose of the ocean. He went there from time to time, and like many, he could stand for hours just staring into the water, amazed by the infinity of it. The drive to Zuma Beach took longer than he'd expected, but he didn't mind. He had his choice of many beaches, but Zuma was the first place he'd seen the ocean, and it seemed fitting for him to return there. He'd grown up the child of privilege in Spokane, Washington, and his only family, his Aunt Sadie, his mother's sister, still lived there. He was only 8 years old the summer his father had loaded him, his mother, and an assortment of luggage into the old station wagon and announced they were taking off on an adventure to California. He smiled at the memory. It had been years since he'd thought of that trip. His father had pulled into the parking lot, and Colin had pressed his 8-year-old face to the back window and stared in amazement at the body of water that stretched endlessly before him. He'd flung open the door of the car and ran as fast as his short legs would carry him. His sneakers had immediately filled with sand, but he hadn't cared. He'd needed to get as close to the water as he could. Suddenly he heard his mother's voice, and it was so real, so vivid, that he wouldn't have been surprised to find her in the seat beside him. "The boy is happy, Maynard," she had said to his father. All three of them had stood in the afternoon sun, their shoes filled with sand, their hearts filled with peace. A family at the ocean, sharing each other's company in the wonder of the world. It had been the trip of a small boy's life, and suddenly he was grateful he'd had it, more grateful than he'd ever been. He missed his parents. They had been good to him. They had loved him more than they could have ever said. And suddenly he realized, by blocking them out to avoid facing the pain of their deaths, he had also blocked out the good things. His eyes misted behind his designer sunglasses, and although his eyes were moist, the corners of his mouth turned involuntarily into a smile. He was ready for this new chapter in his life, and suddenly all that came before was simply part of the journey, the events of preparation for where life was taking him. Excuse me. It was fitting to be at the ocean. He felt as though the tide of his life was shifting, and that he was being carried along by the waves of change. He felt only slightly insecure, and he saw it as more of an adventure, no matter how much he might have hated why it was happening. He saw the expanse of the ocean as it lay before him, and as it always did, for a moment, it stole his breath. He maneuvered the car expertly into a parking space and hit the small button to restore the roof to its rightful place. He opened the door and stepped out of the car. His eyes took in the ocean, his nose took in the smell, and he felt himself calm as all his senses embraced his surroundings. It was beautiful, and for a moment he just stared at it. "Kate," he whispered, wishing she were at his side. He kicked off the flip-flops he'd bought in the hotel gift shop and held them in his right hand, dropped the keys of the Mustang into the right pocket of his shorts, and headed toward the water. The beach was relatively deserted on this Monday morning, and he felt a peace settle over him. He was right to come. Excuse me. He remembered the picnic lunch he'd shared with his parents so many years before. He walked to the very spot where they had dined on hot dogs and salads carefully prepared by his mother in the kitchen in Spokane. The picnic tables were still scattered about, but had probably been replaced at some point over the 30-odd years since they'd sat there. He ran his hands over the cool wood on the bench and sat facing the water. He closed his eyes and remembered the day, the memories coming back in waves. He remembered his mother's laughter and his father's smile. He could almost smell the hot dogs cooking over the charcoal, and although he dined at the best restaurants all over the country, he wondered if he'd ever had a finer meal than the one he'd shared with his parents on that beautiful July day. As the memories came, he remembered something else, something he'd forgotten. He left the flip-flops on the ground next to the picnic table and set out in search of the tree. It was impossible, he knew. Still, he had to check. He'd been a curious boy in his youth, and he'd been a collector. He'd collected things, and as a boy, he'd carried the treasures in his pocket. He found the tree, and 30 years later, it still stood strong and proud. It was taller, as was he, but the way he felt when he stared into its outstretched branches was the same. He knelt at its base and pushed his hand into the crevice time had made there. His fingers reached into the farthest back corner of the mossy opening, and suddenly they made contact with the treasure he sought. He wrapped his fingers around the object and pulled it free. The little pewter horse was exactly where he'd left it more than 30 years before. And although he looked down at the hand of a man, it was the fingers of a small boy he saw there. His past and present collided in perfect harmony, and he wrapped his fingers around the horse and pulled his fist to his chest. Amazing, he whispered as the tears slid down his cheeks. Colin stood and fished in the pocket of his shorts. He had to make an exchange. He was taking something from his past, and he would leave something in its place. The cargo shorts had numerous pockets, but still he found nothing he could leave, nothing of any great meaning. He pulled his wallet from his back pocket and opened it. The leather was smooth and worn, and he carried it back to the table. He had something. Something he couldn't have imagined parting with, but something appropriate. The photo had been forgotten over the years, and he reached into the tiny pocket of the wallet and pulled it free. The photo was yellowed with age and more dear to him than he'd ever admit, and although he couldn't imagine leaving it, he knew it was right. A stranger had taken the picture, but the people who looked back at him were familiar. It was taken more than 30 years ago, and his mother and father stood one on each side of him and smiled at the photographer as the ocean lay behind them. It had been taken here, at this place, on that memorable day in the life of an 8-year-old boy. The corners of the photo were curled, but time had aged him too, and his tears continued to fall as he vividly remembered the carefully preserved moment. It wasn't what he had in mind, this item from his past, but still he knew it was right. He no longer needed the photo. The memory would stay with him forever. He stood and turned back toward the tree, his offering held tightly in his right hand. He knelt as he had before and pushed the photo into the corner of the crevice. Time would not be kind to it, he knew, and it would no longer be protected from the elements as it had been in the old weathered wallet. "It's okay," he whispered to himself as he stood and wiped his eyes. He walked with purpose back to the picnic table, taking his cell phone from his left-hand pocket. He dialed the number to the hotel, and his call was answered on the first ring by the concierge.